Okay, hopefully you can see the thing we just got from the AP. I'm setting up my camera. I just set it back again because I had a few little issues of it not showing. So it looks like I'm on. Okay, so a couple things. First off, the College Board just sent a big, I am not making this one up, 51-page guide on writing the AP exam. And so I just want to make sure you got that. Okay, most of it does not apply to us. Most of it is, for example, like foreign language and a few other things. They have a few special directions because they have to record it. So not all of it applies, but it gives the basic outline of what you need to do. But there's a couple things in there. You have to read through this because it does give information about testing the program, testing the uploading of your papers. You can either type it or you can type it or you can write it and take a picture of it, and either of them will work. But a couple things about this, and this one you have to do for me too for the DBQ. It if you write it and take a picture of it, you have to make sure that you rotate it up and down. You rotate it so the right side is up and it's not on its side, because any extra time they have to take grading it will I'm just going to tell you the way it is. They will be annoyed and they're going to have to rotate it and go through it. And so they're going to look at it as you really didn't take any effort to try to get this prepared for they have them to grade it. And so it will affect you. And for me, you have to rotate if you write your DBQ, you have to rotate it, because Teams does not have an apparatus to rotate it. If it's just a few sentences, it's not a big deal, or checking your notes, it's not a big deal. But for DBQ, I won't grade it. I'll send it back and say you have to redo it. So back to this then. It gives all the information you need. Please browse through it. They have information about it, and what you have to do is you have to get it. You need an AP Exam ETicket to test, and so please look at that. You can access it by the but you have to get this on email or access it yourself within 2 days before you test. So you have got to get this e-ticket. And so you got to make sure that you're signed into the College Board and signed into, well, remember we did that like the first month of the year. Well, I didn't know how I would use it in class, but now I'm glad we did it because of this happening. It has issues about the exam schedule, a few things about it, a few kind of, I'm just going to be honest with you, misleading things about how they grade the AP exam. Don't worry about it. They're just putting all that in there for you. They really want you to take the exam. They need the money, so they're going to push the whole thing about colleges will take it and all that. We don't know. We have no idea. We just got to do the best you can. And if you cannot take it on that day, you can request a makeup exam, and they will show you how to do it. So just look at that. What page is that on? We're on page 18 for looking for a makeup. So please, if you need a makeup, look at that and get that information down. I know it'll cost extra, like a third more, like 30 or 40 bucks. And then they have 5 steps to take before exam day. So review your contact information. Make sure that you have the technology, so you need something. They've set this up so you can send it in by phone, by iPad or tablet, by laptop or by computer. Just make sure you have that set up. And if there's any issues, you must please contact your counselor and practice submitting the exam on May 4th. Do that, so make sure everything works and gather what you need. That's why that review list is so important. You need that review list. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you a 1-page from 1896 to 1945 sheet because it's all relatively fresh. Yes, that will be due, but I want to narrow it down because this should be very fresh in your mind. and then receive your examination confirmation. So make sure you read through that. And so this goes through all the information you need. And yes, there's a lot of stuff. But like I said, most of it will not necessarily apply. They're trying to get every possibility taken care of. So on your own, look at that. Please look at that. If you have any questions, you can ask me. But your counselors are the ones that actually administer the test. I have nothing to do with actually administering the test. So if there's a big question about this that you're not sure about, you have to contact me. You can ask me or contact them. You can ask me, but I have a very limited ability to affect this. You have to ask them. So they also have, I put this in there, a checklist to make sure you have for the day of the exam. So it is all on, I included this. And lastly, the rubric. Yeah, what a word. So the rubric for the DBQ, remember you have 45 minutes, and that's why you can't waste time. That's why you need that review packet in front of you. You need it filled out. You're not going to have time to go back and look things. You think, oh, I'll look it up on the Google. You won't have time. 45 minutes. You have barely enough time to organize and read the documents and write the essay. And so please look at the rubric. But things we've talked about before, you need a good thesis. Contextualization, that's background. 2 to 3, maybe more if you have room, solid bits of information that go around the same era as the DBQ. Things outside of your actual answer. The 2 body paragraphs. So for example, if it's talking about the the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, that's when you talk about the actual Treaty of Versailles, the ending of the war, the post-war depression. You talk about something, the dropping of the atomic bomb. Well, the decision to drop the atomic bomb, wasn't there a big war going on that just ended and all kinds of stuff happening? That's when you bring that up. The background information, talk about the ending of the war. You need that. If it's the events of the 1850s, and it talks about the events leading up to the Civil War, that's when you bring up the Industrial Revolution. And if it's a question about, let's say, secession in 1860, that's when you bring up things like, if you're not going to talk about the Dred Scott decision, you bring it up in the opening paragraph. You bring up the Compromise of 1850 if you're not going to talk about that. You bring up Manifest Destiny, the Industrial Revolution. You need that. That's a point. And then what we talked about here, you need 4. Do you need to cite 4 documents? No quotes. Remember, they want your words and show how the document relates to your thesis and related to a piece of factual information. And then for 2 of those, show why they have that bias because of either the historical content, the purpose, or the point of view of the author or the document. And then lastly, just make sure you have a well-organized essay. So that is what you need. Here it is. It's all on. This is what I have. I'm putting up on the screen. This is what I have for posts. I don't have any idea what you guys get. This is one of the problems I have. I don't know how you upload. Most of you figured it out, but I can't do that. It's not very user-friendly, this program, but that's what we're stuck with. But I put down the exam materials. Also included the final DBQ assignment. It's not what I want. It's not going to sync with PowerSchool, but I just want to make sure I get it out. So please turn it in. The DBQ is due Monday. You must have it written by Monday. If you don't have it written by Monday, the best you can get will be a 90%, not 100%. I'm giving you a full week. I'll include some more information about that, but that's the DBQ. And cite your documents at the end of the sentence. Do not put Doc A in the middle of a sentence. Do not put that in. Do not start a sentence within document 1. Put down the author. It was Harry Truman said, or whatever. All right, I've said that many times, but for a few of you that seems to be an issue. Make sure you get that. That is improper. It is awkward. Okay, so that's the material. I will include a few more things. Some of you might have noticed that I told you they're having syncing problems, so I went through and I started putting zeros for things you have not turned in. As I've said before, I will take late work. But if you aren't... if you do get it done and turn it in. You have to let me know. I'm not going to go back and go through the program and look for everything. It's not user-friendly. It takes a long time. I've already gone through it many times. So if you turn it in late, don't expect me to find it. I won't. But I will give you credit if you go back. And that includes for everything. I understand how difficult this is. I understand there's time issues, but at the same time, you got to get it done. All right. So let's go ahead then and get started where I wanted to go today. And yes, we're starting the Cold War. And some of you might be thinking, wait a second. The DBQ ends in 1945. Well, actually, it doesn't in 45. The Cold War stretches on. So it stretches on 45. What it really means is the beginning of the Cold War. Yeah, I know, but this is still an AP US history class. I'm still have to cover this era. So I'm going to go through and keep covering this, but then I will go back. Oh, one more thing. On Monday or Tuesday, I'm going to have a mandatory meeting, and I think I'm going to make it on Monday. So I'll put out there that everyone has to be there. I'll put it on the AP US history team that I created, that everybody will be on there. Every single class must be on there, and I'm going to start reviewing through the packet. And I'm going to go through issues of the packet. And so instead of having a normal class day, I will spend as long as I want on the first 3 pages of the packet. I will go through everything I can think of. And also on that day, I'll give you a few more things to review. One of the big things you have to think about doing is how do you get as much information in writing a thesis? So I'm going to give you possible topics for you to think about that thesis statement. So let's go and get to then the Cold War and the 1950s. Cold War and the 50s. So, oh, we got a question. I didn't see it. Yeah, on the review packet, and if you've already done it, then don't worry about it. But after 1896 on the review packet, I'm not gonna accept. I'm not gonna grade. But I will give you from 1896 to 1945 1 page. So instead of basically 2 pages, I'm just going to give you 1 page. I'm going to narrow it down because this should be relatively fresh, and I want to make sure you have time to get all the rest done. So I'm going to add that 1 page to it, and I could do it one of 2 ways. I could redo. Well, I'm just going to give you a page that you just add. I might. Just make that a separate assignment. Okay, so Cold War in the 1950s. And yes, this is one of the first McDonald's. So San Bernardino, California is the first McDonald's. This is actually not in San Bernardino, but the old style. I like the old McDonald's. So let's get to a little bit of the Cold War. And one of the most important things that happened, the way to think about it is after the war, after all this sacrifice, the hell that people went through, and every country had different and varying degrees, there was this real hope that the United Nations, as they called the countries unified against fascism and Japanese aggression, there's a reason why they came up with the term United Nations, would rally together under the ideals laid out in the Atlantic Charter that Roosevelt and Churchill did in 1941. That they will, in these ideals of a better post-war world, will come together in some kind of peace. And here's the meetings of one of the signing of the Atlantic Charter at the first United Nations. And this was in San Francisco in 45, but they would eventually build the United Nations in New York City. And they would come together. Thought I heard something. And so the Soviet Union and Stalin would alleviate some of their totalitarianism, open up their population. The United States, some of the rough edges of capitalism and imperialism will go away. I mean, people really had these hopes. And this would be personified by a couple different things. First off, let's go right here. The Nuremberg war trials, these crimes against humanity, that there would be a tribunal of judges from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union trying German war criminals. And here are just a few. For example, here's Herman. Here, what just happened here. Oops, hit the wrong button. There's all kinds of weird stuff going on. Isn't this fun? So here's Hermann Goering right there. He was the Reichsmarshal of Germany, head of the Luftwaffe of the Air Force. And he would be tried here for war crimes. He would actually commit suicide. Somebody would smuggle him in some cyanide before his actual execution. But they would try these with the idea that the world will come together and never allow this again. There are consequences for this type of action. Of course, don't forget, the United States, for example, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians at the firebombing of Tokyo, not to mention the 2 atomic bombs. And yet, it's the victors who decide the trial. So there's always holes here. And Japanese war criminals would be tried. 100 would be executed by the United States, Great Britain, Australia, India. And one important thing to know about that, many of the Japanese who would be executed, like General Yamashita, who was the commander in the Philippines and Malaya, he would be executed for treatment of POWs, the torture of POWs, partially the water torture, which will be known as waterboarding after the 1980s, and the United States would do that a little bit later. Everything kind of comes around. One more thing was this creation of the United Nations. All the countries would come together. And this diagram that's actually not as complex as it looks, but the big issue of this will be the Security Council. The Security Council will have 5 permanent members, with the idea being all the important decisions, especially about collective security. Remember Article 10 of the League of Nations. The Security Council, of these members, original 11, now 15 members, but they all had a veto, and it became clear pretty quickly that the United Nations really won't have the power that a lot of people in the post-war world hope. Yes, it is important. Yes, it can do amazing things. But still, the Security Council, we'll see it right away when it comes to Korea or other issues down the road. So, let's get to the fears then. And one thing about the fears both had, don't forget Yalta. That Yalta Agreement was a wartime agreement that Germany would be divided up in occupation zones, but also Russia would enter the war against Japan 3 months after VE Day. Potsdam too, when the Soviet Union announced there won't be free elections and there won't be reparations. Yalta and Potsdam, you could really bring up this idea of a lot of the fears and misunderstanding that came about would come from those agreements, but also long-standing, for example, the M's kind of blocked out there, but hatred and fear of communism. The United States has had a long, I'm going to get this to the back. I thought I did. Everything okay? Good. So, the United States has had a long time, if you remember, bomb throwing anarchists, and the Red Scare just happened 20 years before this. So this long time fear of communism, and the thing about communism to a lot of Americans, especially after years of depredation during the Great Depression and sacrifice of World War II. And now, coming out of the war, we'll finally be able to enjoy the bounties of the United States and this new economy and world. And communism represented somebody who wants to take that away. And to a lot of people, I worked hard for this, and you're going to take it away and give it to them, other people. And that will be the same argument that will be used against, for example, giving rights to African Americans. So many people, you're going to take away my rights and give it to them. Or women's liberation. Men are thinking you're going to take away my rights and give it to women who might not be deserving. That's that point of view. It's pretty social Darwinistic. Next, Brest-Litovsk. When the Soviets, the brand new Bolshevik government in Russia bailed out of World War I, with the Brest-Litovsk Agreement, the West never forgot. This is still in their mind that we cannot trust them. And then the purges. Stalin, in a desperate effort to drive out any potential ally, any potential rival within the Soviet government, would be responsible for the death of over 1 million government and other officials in the Soviet Union. This would also be called the Terror, where they would round up almost every single person who had any kind of power in the Soviet Union. To Stalin, that was a potential threat. So I mentioned this once before. For example, 2/3 of the officer corps of the Red Army would be purged. Most would be tortured to death, and their families, in this terror for Stalin to take control. Virtually all the old Bolsheviks who were still alive in 1934, almost all of them, all the old Bolsheviks who led the revolution, if they were still alive, almost all of them would die an unnatural death. Stalin killed off almost all of his enemies. This was very much copying Hitler's Night of the Long Knives I mentioned once before. This was part of the reason why Hitler would attack the Soviet Union, thinking the Soviets had gotten rid of all their officers. They are on the edge of collapse. This combined with radical industrialization of the Soviet Union, and collectivization, leading to mass starvation. In the first 20 years of Bolshevik rule, 20 million Soviets would die, most of famine, but many of the purges. So Stalin was an evil and terrifying man. I was just looking for a picture. I had it in a book, but I could not find it online, so I'll have to scan it and give it to you, or take a picture of it and get it to you a little bit later. There was a picture of a funeral of a leading Bolshevik, and in 1927, it has all the old Bolsheviks, including Trotsky and Stalin, and virtually all of them in that funeral procession would die at the hands of Stalin. Well, purposely killed. And so within the Soviet Union, there was real fear, and he was an evil man, the most paranoid man ever to live. Next, he made a deal with the devil, the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And the idea was he could do it again. That was part of the reason for unconditional surrender. Telling the Soviets, remember Roosevelt said this at Casablanca back in 43, we pledge, we'll finish the war, don't you make a separate peace with Germany. And then lastly, Stalin promised peaceful elections in Poland and Eastern Europe, and then turned around and didn't have these elections. To the United States and Britain, to many in the West, this was an example of Stalin scooping up land, getting more land. And I should be very clear about it. Stalin did want to control areas, and yes, he did want more power for the Soviet Union. But to the Americans, this looks like Stalin is trying to take over the rest of Europe. And that means Germany, and that dividing line between the Western and Eastern occupation zones really would be the edge of, or the front line of Soviet expansion. Now, the United States never understood that Stalin's thinking, I got to have friendly neighbors because I don't want another war. But that was their fear. And this idea that communism is on its way, and they're going to start pecking away, and soon we'll be defending the beaches of Wyoming. It's coming. So those are American fears. The Soviets also had their fears, and that cartoon shows rich capitalists on the bodies of workers. Even though the Soviet Union has created a monstrous totalitarian state, they still used all the rhetoric of socialism. So, first off, the United States has always been anti-communist. They blame the communists for everything. In fact, to stop the Bolshevik Revolution, the Western allies in World War I, including the United States, I've mentioned this before, intervened in the Russian Civil War. They sent troops to Murmansk, the U.S. sent troops to Murmansk in northern Russia and Vladivostok in Siberia. They attacked the Bolsheviks. And so the thought was, they hate us, they've already stopped us once, and they'll do it again. So we can't trust them. Number two. Russia was not invited, the Soviet Union is more proper for Munich, but they were not invited to either the Treaty of Versailles Or it looks like a massive bird by my bird feeder. Rest. A crow just flew by. I was going to say an eagle, but no. So, Russia was not invited to either Versailles or Munich. And the Munich conference in 38, to Stalin, this was a stab in the back by Britain and France. And so they cannot trust the Allies. Next, the delay of the Second Front. Millions, and I'm not exaggerating, millions of Soviets died in Western Russia. Millions died stopping the Soviet attack. But the United States and Britain did not actually open a legitimate Second Front D-Day until I'm looking at this to make sure this is working, until June 6, 1944. And to Stalin's point of view, they're trying to win the war with Soviet blood. Kill as many, or basically pit the two, Hitler and Stalin, the two dictators against each other. And Stalin will beat Hitler, but be a shadow, or just a shadow of his former self, and the Soviet Union will be destroyed. And there's an element of truth to that. Churchill was thinking, at least up to the Tehran conference in 43, end of 43, that the best case scenario would be the two horrible dictators knock each other off. Well, hopefully Stalin knocks Hitler off, but then the country is destroyed, and therefore Britain and the United States, but especially Britain, will have no threats. I should add United States, Britain, and France here. So there's an element of truth to that. Next, one of the biggest and blunders in American history will happen the day after VE Day. A convoy of Lend-Lease aid is on its way to the Soviet Union. It's going north of Norway. This is my picture of them going north of the Oil Sea. I'm imagining I have a map. And they're going over the northern route. They call it the Murmansk convoy route. And it is going past Norway on the way to Russia. The U.S. has promised to continue Lend-Lease aid after the war because of the sacrifices that the Soviet Union made to win the war. Well, somebody from the U.S. State Department ordered that convoy to turn around and come back to the United States. And the thing was, once they realized this order was given, and just a day after it, they ordered the convoy to go back, and it did get to the Soviet Union. But Stalin heard. And so Stalin heard this as, I knew it. They were just trying to use me and, well, me, that's why he looked at it, but the Soviet Union and their people to win the war, and then they're going to let us starve. And he never forgot that. It's like, I knew it. I knew it. Everything I said, I told you so. They're going to do it. And then at Potsdam, when Truman said no reparations, Stalin's like, I knew it. They're trying to starve us. So, his greatest fear, though, was that the Western Allies would rearm Germany and send them back to do it again. And he had this in the back of his mind. If he pulled out of his occupation zone, if he pulled out, the U.S. and Britain will slowly but surely rearm the Soviet Union and come back again. And if he doesn't have friendly governments in Poland and Hungary and Romania as a buffer zone, they'll sweep right in and take it all. He was convinced of this. Now, looking back, this seems just insane. How could the United States and Britain and France lose so many people, so much to defeat Germany, to turn around and send them back again? Yeah, but two things. First off, Stalin is intensely paranoid. Intensely paranoid of the West, and he saw all the anti-communist rhetoric as proof that they're going to do it again. And secondly, remember Hitler kind of thought this. And Stalin knew this and didn't know how far the negotiations went, which was nowhere, but he didn't know. And he's thinking if Hitler thought the Battle of the Bulge would convince the British and the United States to join the Soviet Union, or joined in the attack against the Soviet Union. Maybe they'll do it again. High-ranking U.S. generals like General George Patton, right after the war, said we should be doing that. He was a nut. He would die he'd be hit by a car and die in 45, so nothing would come out of that. But there was elements of truth. So those were Soviet fears. And so here is the beginning of the divide. You can see this, the Great Divide here. And here's Stalin, and he's using, it says on there, free Eastern governments, a pork chop for a dog, coming, basically it's supposed to be kind of Europe or Central Europe, and I'll get the free elections and be ensnared in the Soviet trap. You see the red star for the Red Army. And also you notice, sure, the swastika is crossed out, but here's the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union. And so, while this is going on, the United States still has atomic bombs. Let's go back to the dropping of the atomic bomb. Now remember, I went through all the things that were going on. The U.S. was beginning firebombing. Submarines had completely blockaded Japan, and they were out of food, or 6 months to their food reserves were gone, 3 months to their oil reserves were gone. The Japanese Army and Navy was utterly and completely defeated. That's what part of the reason they resorted to kamikaze. And remember, the Japanese goal was a negotiated peace. And they were sending peace feelers out through the Soviet Union, their mistake, that they were willing to negotiate a peace. And the big negotiation, the big sticking point was the emperor. I repeat, the emperor. Japan was talking about ending the war, basically surrendering except one condition, keep their emperor. You notice I said the emperor 3 times. Gee, I wonder if the emperor might be an important point for the DBQ. Wait, let me do the thinking look. Yes. The U.S. is firebombing and killing so many people. Remember all that's going on. Well, the United States tested the first atomic bomb. Remember, that's Trinity. And then they dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima and Fat Man on Nagasaki. So the United States had 3 atomic bombs. They blew one up, dropped the second one on Hiroshima, and the next one on Nagasaki. They didn't have another atomic bomb for 6 months. It would take that long. So if you're wondering why the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, it's because they had 2 left. By dropping 2 implies they have a lot more. Implies we have more and we're going to drop them. They actually would not have another atomic bomb, a model like the Trinity, for 6 months later. And they dropped it. They decided partially, they didn't really know what the bomb would do right afterwards. It was a few weeks after the dropping of the atomic bombs that the first Americans arrived in Nagasaki and Hiroshima to see the real effects. They knew radiation was there. They just didn't know about fallout. And fallout is the reaction of the dirt and soil as an explosion. You can see this bomb right here. You see the mushroom cloud? That takes up all the dirt that is now irradiated and really dirty as in this high levels of radiation, and spews it into the atmosphere as it begins to fall all over, wherever the wind path will take it. That is called fallout. And they didn't know about that. And heck, for years, they still don't really know about it. To this day, they don't know everything about it. So they're going to do more tests. I forgot to say one thing about the atomic bomb, and let me say it right now. A lot of people have said, why not do just a test like they would do 6 months later at a place called Bikini Atoll, an island in the Marshall Islands? Why not just do a test for Japan? Tell the Japanese, we have a bomb that can destroy an island. And they find a relatively uninhabited island, and they fly a B-29 over, they drop the bomb, blow the island up, and said, we have 100 more, and we'll drop it on Japanese cities if you surrender. And a lot of people said, why not just do that? That would save lives. Yes, but let's get to one big important thing about that. Let's say they have the plane come by, we're going to drop an atomic bomb and destroy the island. and the B-29 falls, they drop the bomb, and thud. It's a dud. It doesn't work. Then we look like idiots. Not just to Japan, but to the Soviet Union. And there's one more thing. What about the Soviet Union? We're fighting a war against Japan, a country that brutalized POWs and attacked the United States first. We can go into the reasons why that happened, but that's irrelevant here. Do you think the Soviets would respect the United States if they were scared to drop a bomb on a mortal enemy? To someone like Stalin, the thinking would be he won't respect that. And if he won't respect that he won't respect the United States and thinks the US doesn't have enough guts to drop that atomic bomb on Japanese civilians, would the US have enough guts to drop it on Moscow? So we're showing how ruthless we are. So let's get back to the test. That is what we call an amazingly big hint for the DBQ. Amazingly. So back here. Bikini Atoll was this island. In fact, they moved all the people who lived there, off. And yes, they strapped down a bunch of sheep and other animals to see what it would do, the radiation would do, the explosion, the blast effect. Yeah, they butchered a bunch of animals. And they skinned parts of it to see the radiation burns. I didn't want to think about it. But they exploded an atomic bomb in 46. So this is 6 months after, so it's early 46, and this is the Trinity bomb. And it's partially telling the Soviet Union, we have more bombs, but it's also we want to see what they do. So much of the testing that they would do all the way till 1963 was, hey, we have enough bombs that we can test and still have enough to drop on you. And this became a big deal, a big news story. But also, Stalin, he saw this as, they're threatening me. They're trying to show me up. By the way, this was in the newspaper, so much about Bikini Atoll that a French designer was designing a bathing suit, and there it is, the very first of this two-piece bathing suit, and taking advantage of the fact that Bikini Atoll was in the news, he called it Cleveland. No, he called it the Bikini, and that's where it comes from, and that's the actual first one. So, oh, there's a picture. I even have that on the website. So, as we're doing this, I'm just pumping information into your brain. So we are just literally downloading this. I mean, think about it. We're using all the internets and the tubes, and we're just jamming it right into your skull. And this can only mean one thing. Only one thing. A practice thesis. Evaluate the following statement. The main cause of the Cold War was the mutual fears of the United States and the Soviet Union. Please evaluate that statement. So I've talked about fears, Yalta. Now write this as a 4-paragraph essay. So take the main point of the question, position. So do you agree or disagree with that? You're evaluating that statement. And then for your blueprint, only A and B. You're going to write this as 2 body paragraphs. You will have 2 minutes. Write it down just to practice on it and go. Oh, one more thing. If you want to post this in the chat on Teams, or I will also check YouTube. If you have your thesis and want me to look at it after the fact, please do it. I'll look at it. You have 2 minutes. I'm going to, it's actually beautiful outside, so I'm going to walk outside and look at the birds and give you a second to look at it. If you have a question, put it on the Teams. I have this with me and I'll be able to check. Not Teams. Put it on the YouTube chat. Okay, I got no questions, but I hope everyone is writing this. And for those of you who watch this later, quick write one up. But it's a relatively easy question. All you have to do is address the idea that yes, the Cold War was caused by this, and an American fear and a Soviet fear. Something like that. List them out. Oh, we got one. Got a question? That's actually a very good thesis, Aaron. Just add, just make sure that you show that you have to address something about fears. But other than that, that's very good. That'll work perfectly. And remember, all you need to do is show that, and if we're doing a DBQ, if that's the question, take two of the documents to show one for one paragraph, one direction, two of the documents the other direction, and add half, as much outside information as you can get. Let me show you mine, which is very much like the one Aaron put up. The red misunderstanding is seen in the Soviet fear, anger. Okay, so that's one problem when I typed this up real fast for a class. The Cold War, I had a lot of typos. This is one of the problems when I did this really fast. I want to get this done as quickly as possible with the idea. The fears that bred misunderstanding as seen in the Soviet anger of Allied post-war actions and America's fear of Stalin and his ambitions. And so, very generic, very basic thesis statement. And that's one thing, before you type in your thesis statement, I just gave you a great example of that. Before you type it in, and I know we only have 45 minutes, so it's got to be, you have to be quick and concise, quick little shorthand. But please, write it down first, and so you can rewrite it in your essay. They will understand that there's going to be typos and mistakes and a few little grammatical errors in an essay, especially when you only have 45 minutes to write. But the one sentence you got to make sure that's correct is that thesis. Write it down, go back through and change it again. Or make any typographical errors or grammatical errors. But that is a pretty good thesis statement. That'd be a good question. It's kind of like the DBQ question. This one's more about the atomic bomb and Japan, but it lays out really nice for a 4-paragraph essay, the DBQ I gave you. So, if you have any other questions, want to send it to me, I'll quick answer it. You can do it either here or do it on the chat in Teams. Drop me a quick email. The problem is I'm getting so many emails right now that if I miss it, or sometimes I open it up thinking I'll answer this in a sec. I got these other ones and I forget. I'm sorry, it's bad habits. I will get to you. All right, so last couple things in. So let's talk about the collapse of peace. Peace collapsed, and it was shocking how fast it was. And I have to add, part of the reason it was so shocking is you had all these post-war hopes. We're coming together, we're allies. Then all of a sudden, we're mortal enemies. And this really was an issue. So there's Harry Truman. Truman always had this problem where he wanted to prove he was tough. I mentioned this at his first meeting with Stalin at Potsdam. He always wanted to show that he was tough. You're not going to back him down. And it really had something to do, and he even would admit this later, with his glasses. Little boys with glasses couldn't do anything. Now, we think of today, glasses are relatively durable. If you have glasses, you can do almost everything. Yeah, it's an issue. But back then, not only were glasses not as durable, they were shockingly expensive. So kids could not break their glasses. You just couldn't do it. So if you can't break your glasses, which were just literally pieces of glass which would shatter all the time, they're not, like I said, the lenses aren't near as durable as now. You couldn't play. You couldn't do a lot of the things that you could normally do. And he really had some emotional stigma attached to this, that I will not back down like I had to when I was a little boy. And so he wanted to prove he was tough. Here he is with James Burns, who would become the Secretary of State, and I believe I used one of his documents. And both of them were rabid anti-communists, but they want to show Stalin that they're not going to back down. Now, part of this was bluster. The U.S. wanted to pull out of Europe. The U.S. wanted to go back to having a small army. The U.S. didn't want to be on a wartime footing. And Truman thought, I have to make sure Stalin knows I mean business so I can begin to demobilize. So, as Truman would say in 46, we have been babying them. We've been letting them have everything they want in Europe. We allowed them to not have elections. We allowed them to come into the war against Japan and scoop up territory. Don't forget, we begged them. But he wasn't thinking that in 46. Quit babying them. Now, I should add, to Stalin, this attitude was infuriating. Attitude was infuriating. The reason why it was infuriating, as he saw, my country was destroyed. We lost over 20 million people to win the war, and we don't deserve some consideration for that. To his point of view, that means the West is out to get him. So, Germany and Berlin was divided. And don't forget, Berlin was inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. And so Stalin decided to use this as leverage, especially Berlin, because Berlin has a French, British, and American occupation zone, the western half of Berlin. When I grew up, it would be called West Berlin. We'll divide this and use this as leverage against Americans and their desire to get tough. And so here you have both of them. Truman going to get tough, thinking Stalin's trying to take over the world. Stalin thinking, I don't get the consideration I deserve, and this is clearly an effort by the West to destroy me. And so, Russia literally stripped their occupation zone, soon to be called East Germany, of everything of value. And the U.S. would respond with cutting off aid. What I mean is, literally, they stripped everything. They went through the occupation zone basically with the thinking of, you're not going to give us reparations? Well, we're going to take every car, every street light, every light bulb. We would go into houses and they would literally rip out pipes. They would take everything, including the kitchen sink, which they would take. They actually cut up chunks of the Autobahn, big, huge pieces of cement, put it on trains and brought it back to the Soviet Union. They stripped everything of the East of value, which of course meant more suffering of the East. And the legacy of this goes there today. If you cross into areas that was the former East Germany, like if you're in, go outside of Berlin and go into those areas of East Germany, it is, you could tell they made it pretty hastily and primitively out in the 1950s. The U.S. response was, this shows you what the Soviets are going to do. They're just going to loot and pillage all these areas, and they cut off Lend-Lease aid. And by cutting off Lend-Lease aid, because of this, we have these two different overreactions looking back at it. You could argue that's the beginning of the Cold War. To Stalin, who is saying, I knew they're out to get me, they're coming to get me, and then he could turn around and say, I told you so. I knew it. Look at, they cut off aid. Well, the U.S. is saying, they're stripping the eastern part of Germany. I knew it. They're trying to steal everything. And so, here we have the beginnings of the Cold War, and this is the great picture of setting up satellite states, and the question mark saying, where's this hand going? Western Europe is at threat. Here is Stalin's desire for a buffer zone, but it's implying he wants to make this wall fortification. We want friendly states, friendly states, friendly states. And there's elements of truth there, but you can imagine where this is going as they begin to put Stalinist governments all through Central Europe. And then, at the end of 1946, Winston Churchill, who is no longer prime minister, he's in parliament, and he would come back as prime minister. He gave a speech, actually at Southwestern Missouri State College, but he made a speech where he said, and you can read it, but let me read it to you in case it doesn't come in very clear, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. So Stettin is here, Trieste is here. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lies the ancient capitals of Central and Eastern Europe. And this is where we would get the term, well actually it would make it popular, the term Iron Curtain. And the Iron Curtain would come to represent the countries under Soviet domination. Now, people claim that Churchill invented this term. He did not invent that term. It actually came from the head of propaganda for the Nazis, at least the term in this context, Joseph Goebbels, who was sending out word to the West in 1945. If we don't stop the Soviets, an Iron Curtain will come down across Europe, and those areas will be under Soviet Bolshevik domination. So Churchill took it. You might also notice one more thing. The Iron Curtain here doesn't go to Trieste, it goes around Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia would form a communist dictatorship, but outside of Soviet domination. They liberated themselves from Nazi rule. And Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia would create this pretty nasty police state in Yugoslavia, but outside of the Red Curtain. So it was always this kind of weird hybrid state. And after he died, 10 years after he died, Yugoslavia, it blew up and would turn into civil war. So last couple things. There's where we get the Iron Curtain term. So here, this is the real fear. Here's Churchill saying, an Iron Curtain of Soviet rule has come down, just as the United States is pulling out of Europe, just as the United States is disarming. If the United States is disarming and pulling out, what will the future lead? Will this mean that this Iron Curtain will spread further west and take more and more land? So here's a cartoon of, here's Churchill, who's no longer prime minister, but looking under the Iron Curtain. And it says, no admittance by order of Joe. But here's the big deal. It shows Western Europe with nothing except, you see it right here, rubble and scared people. But look what's happening here. The idea that the Soviets are rebuilding and they are this dynamic country or dynamic system ready to conquer and take over while the West is stagnant and falling apart. And so that is the fear. Now, by the way, yes, both sides were ruined. The Soviets were way behind. Their country was devastated. But the fear was they're ahead. And we don't know what they're doing, though, because there's an Iron Curtain. And the whole thing would blow up for the last thing for today in Turkey and Greece. Now, of course, you're thinking, obviously Turkey and Greece. Here's an article from Time magazine showing Stalin advancing his sphere of influence through these puppet states, Finland and the East. But you also notice here, Istanbul and the Dardanelles. The Soviets, and then before that Russia, they've wanted this since Peter the Great, since Catherine the Great. They've wanted this and fought many wars with Turkey. So they're eyeing all this area. Boy, they get this. They're right in the Mediterranean. And who knows? Italy, Spain, Wyoming. All my fault. So let's get what happened here. After World War II, actually it started during the war, there was a revolutionary group of communist guerrillas in Greece. And Greece was a puppet government of the British. And this communist revolt there in Greece, and you know, Greece is, where's my mouse? Right next to Turkey. Britain, though, was broke after the war. They had nothing. And they were too broke to support this anti-communist dictatorship. And this is going into 1947. By the way, this is the same year that Britain lost the crown jewel of their empire. Lost. India. India finally won their independence. And so Britain is looking at it, we're losing everything. We're out of money. Britain would go through rationing. Remember rationing I talked about for the United States during World War II? They continued rationing all the way up till 1960. That's how broke they were. So they could no longer support this. And they realized the communists might win. They might win. So Britain asked the United States for aid. Now remember, the United States is pulling out. Truman wants to get out of this. The U.S. Army actually from 45 to 47 has gone, the U.S. military, from 15 million people down to 1 million. The U.S. is demobilizing as fast as possible. We want to pull back. So many Americans after the war want to go back to just no war, no depression, and isolationism. A real conservative wave was hitting, at least foreign policy-wise. So Britain asked the United States for aid, and Truman knows conservatives in Congress, Republicans and Democrats who are conservative, are saying, no more. We've done our part. That's Britain's issue. So what does Truman do? Well, first off, I should add, there was the 46th midterm election. Conservative Republicans dominated. They took over Congress for the first time since 1930, and they were very isolationist. And Truman is looking at this going into the 47, saying, no way they'll vote for aid. Yes, they're anti-communist, but they won't vote for aid because they don't care about Greece. Remember, conservative foreign policy is unilateral. We'll do things on our own. We don't see it as all the worlds together, or all the worlds, all the countries together. So that's very isolationist. And how does he do this? Truman is thinking, if the communists win in Greece, other Western European countries might be vulnerable, because if Britain is broke, just imagine how broke Italy is. Just imagine how broke France is, or Belgium, or Netherlands, and of course the Allied occupation zones of Germany. And so what does he do? What about Stalin? What does Stalin want here? Now, to Truman, he is imagining Stalin is pushing this invasion of Greece. He imagines that. We would find out later that Stalin actually won't help this communist revolt in Greece. Stalin will not help. To Stalin's point of view, here's another revolutionary movement I can't control like Yugoslavia, or at the same time, the communist rebellion in China. Stalin is very ambivalent about groups that he doesn't have 100% control. So Stalin is actively actually hurting this revolt in Greece, even though they're winning. But the US and the British think Stalin is behind this. And this is going to lead to one of the most important foreign policy revolutions in American history that will affect the entire nation to this day. So all these things about Turkey and Greece, and here's Truman thinking, how do I help Greece? Because, one more thing I should add about what Truman's thinking. Truman wants to help Greece, thinking if they can stop the communist rebellion in Greece, then the US can pull back because we're stopping them. We won't need more troops, we won't need to rebuild, and it will actually preserve the peace. And so, how does he get it through a conservative Congress? How does he do it? And this is a great cartoon. Here showing Stalin just toying with the Western powers. Like Stalin is this cat and he's the one in charge, and the United States and Britain are weak little mice and Stalin is the big cat. Now, of course, let's be clear about it. Yeah, the Red Army was amazingly huge, but the United States came out of this literally an economic superpower. The United States came out of this with the atomic bomb. The United States came out significantly stronger than ever before. I should add, remember the term economies of scale, that great economic term saying the bigger a country is, it has a competitive advantage. The US has been living off this competitive advantage from World War II to today. The size of the United States has given it so many advantages that it had a competitive advantage in, let's say, financial markets and the dollar over every country, and we're still living off of this. I'm curious to see what the unbelievable depression that's going to happen out of this pandemic will happen out of this. And we're coming to the concept of containment. In fact, I want to stop it right there. I've gone long enough. So, that's where I'm going to end. I will pick this up again tomorrow. I'm going to do another practice review. I'll give a few more little AP notes. Please go through that review packet, and yes, you have a DBQ. But I've given you a full week. I did finally make the assignment, even though it's not syncing right. It's going to be a pain. I wanted it out, so we have to do it. And don't forget, on this DBQ, you can type it or write it, but do whatever you're going to do for the AP exam, the one on May 14th. If you plan on writing it, then write this one and take pictures of it. If you plan on type it, type it. Either one. But you must do that. No more questions? All right, I'm going to do the same thing for this one. I'm going to collect the notes. I'm going to do a real basic test. You know, I kind of want to do it next week, but also got the AP exam. I'm going to decide what to do on that. You know, I want you to review and go through the things. So we might have a very small test next week on where we're at from World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War. We're in a weird situation because I'm not with you and the test being different. So on that and that confusing note, if there are any questions about the assignment, please get them to me. And I will do the note collection thing again at the end of the week. So I'm stopping this. Everyone have a good day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.